Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 97 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we've got our final post-draft rookie rankings as we head on into rookie draft season for your Dynasty leagues. It's a very exciting time of year. Love the rookie drafts. Unfortunately, the rookie prospect pool this year is a bit underwhelming, which is going to be a major theme of today's show. So stick with me. We're going to make it through. I've got, like I said, my top 24, and I'll give you a couple sleepers and whatnot for the third round as well. And we'll get into more of those later round picks in the next couple weeks. But today, I want to pump out our top 24, get everyone ready for your first 2 rounds of your rookie drafts, and get things going. So this is a tight end premium Superflex format. That is what all of my leagues are. That's my preferred way to play Dynasty Fantasy Football. If you are in a single quarterback league, it is pretty simple. You just bump these quarterbacks way down the list. If you're talking Fernando Mendoza, I think you would bump him down probably to late first. I think would be a safe spot in a single quarterback league. And as we run through these rankings, I'll probably drop in the spot where I would have him officially locked in. Same can be said about the other quarterbacks in this draft, Ty Simpson, etc. And if you're in a tight end or a non-tight end premium league, the rankings aren't going to change a ton. But if you wanted to bump a couple of these tight ends down a spot or two, I think that's probably what I would do. In fact, I think looking at my rankings right now, probably 1-2 spots for Kenyon Sadiq, 1 or 2 spots for Eli Stowers, and that would pretty much do it in terms of a non-tight end premium league. So keep that in mind if you play in one of those formats. But for today's show, Superflex tight end premium, and before we get into the actual rankings, I want to remind everyone, as always, make sure that you are following this podcast on your platform of choice. We're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, whatever you listen to your podcasts on, we are there. So go make sure that you are following along so you don't miss any future shows. And go find us on social media as well. So on Twitter or X at Dynasty War Room. You can find me at Andrew Vcourt. We have a YouTube channel at Dynasty War Room, and we have a Facebook page as well. So go check us out there if you are on the old Facebook machine. So with all that out of the way, and of course, well, how could I forget this? Use code WARROOM, all one word, on Fast Draft for a $50 deposit match for your first time using the app. And otherwise, now I think we're ready to move on into the rankings. All right, so I have spent hours and hours and hours combing through all of these profiles, looking at the draft capital, wrestling with a number of major decisions, and we've come to this top 24 as we enter rookie draft season. Fortunately, the number 1 player in these rankings was not difficult at all. It has not changed throughout this entire process. Anyone that's telling you that it's anyone other than Jeremiah Love is not being honest with you. It is Jeremiah Love, running back out of Notre Dame. He went 3rd overall in the NFL draft to the Arizona Cardinals, and he is my tier 1 player in this draft. He is the only tier 1 player in my entire rankings. Jeremiah Love is an elite running back. He's right up there on par with those other elite running backs we've seen in prior drafts. You know, he would be considered probably in the exact same tier as Ashton Genty from last year. In fact, he might even slot in just ahead of him, but he'd be very, very similar. I don't think he would rise quite to the Bijan Robinson level, but he is definitely in that Ashton Genty tier, you know, a top 10 running back in the NFL draft. It only helps him that there really are not any other elite running backs in this class. And he can do everything. He's a 3-down player. He can catch passes. He will be extremely helpful to that Arizona offense. I think we could debate all day long on the proper way to build a team from an NFL standpoint and whether or not taking a running back in the top 10 of the NFL draft is a good way to do that. I think we've seen time after time that it usually doesn't work out well from a winning standpoint, but from a fantasy football standpoint, these players are awesome. They usually they're pretty much the safest players that you can take in fantasy football in Dynasty, and Jeremiah Love is no different. So he is locked in here at the 101 in all formats, and makes this pretty easy. I actually don't mind the Cardinals landing spot. You know, there was a lot of rumbling about Tennessee, about New York, and frankly, I think Arizona is a better landing spot for Jeremiah Love than either of those two places. It's something where you've got other talent on offense. They showed last year that, hey, they'll throw the ball around. I get it's a new coaching staff and whatnot, but Jacoby Brissett still likely to remain the starting quarterback. And, it's an offense that is going to have to compete with a lot of elite teams in their own division. And I just trust the situation a little bit more with the understanding that next year they will likely be drafting, a high-end quarterback in what should be a loaded 2027 quarterback class. So I do like that from that standpoint, as opposed to Tennessee, where I'm still a little bit lukewarm on the situation with Cam Ward, and New York, where there's Cam Skattebo and Tyrone Tracy. Washington probably would have been the best spot for him at 7, but he was too talented in this kind of draft to fall to that point. So Jeremiah Love sits at 101 in my rankings. At number 2, I am going to stick with quarterback Fernando Mendoza out of Indiana as my second overall pick. He went first overall in the draft to the Las Vegas Raiders, and he kicks off tier number 2, which is going to make up 4 players. So it's probably the exact 4 players that you have in mind. It's going to be Fernando Mendoza and then your 3 elite wide receivers in this class. And Mendoza goes to a solid landing spot where he's going to have a good running game behind him with Ashton Genty. They signed Linderbaum at center in free agency, and they got Brock Bowers. A little bit weak at wide receiver. In fact, I was pretty surprised that the Raiders did not address that position at all in the NFL draft, given the number of wide receivers that were picked. But it could be something where, maybe they're looking at this like we are after the fact, going, hey, some of these players really not that great. Let's just roll with what we have. They got some young players still. Jack Besh, Dante Thornton is there. A couple other names. It's not really anything that exciting, but there is Brock Bowers, who is your de facto number 1 wide receiver, will be a great friend to Fernando Mendoza in the passing game. So I think that he is a quarterback you can build around. I think that in terms of fantasy and dynasty value, these first overall pick quarterbacks and any quarterback that really goes in the top 5, top 10, you're guaranteed at least 2 to 3 years of pretty solid value before the bottom drops out. I mean, we've seen guys like Bryce Young struggle for multiple years in a row. There's just, Cam Ward, even last year, really didn't help you at all for fantasy, but his value is holding steady. So we see it every single year. You're going to get at least 2 years as the number 1 overall pick, if not 3, to prove yourself. And I think that Mendoza is going to be absolutely given a pretty long road here. And they have Kirk Cousins, so it's not even a guarantee that he starts right away. But I think if you're drafting at 2 overall in Dynasty, you are in a rebuild situation. And in a Superflex league, a quarterback, especially Mendoza, where you're the one clear elite QB, it matters a lot. You're going to hold a lot of value, and quarterbacks tend to be the currency in those types of leagues. So unless you are loaded at quarterback, you already have 4 starting quarterbacks and 2 locked-in starters, then I think it's a situation where you could absolutely look at Carnell Tate, Mekhi Lemon, Jordan Tyson, whoever your pick is of those 3. Then maybe the situation's a little bit different. You can go ahead and pass on the quarterback. But ideally, I'm not doing that unless I'm locked in with 3 solid, steady, capable starting quarterbacks, and at least 2 of them, being top 12, top 15 options, because again, the quarterbacks are just too important. And if you're picking at 2 naturally, and you didn't acquire that pick through a trade, it does mean your team needs a lot of help. So I don't think there's anything wrong with sort of playing the long game and going with the quarterback. All right, so at number 3, I do have Carnell Tate out of Ohio State, wide receiver. He went 104 in the NFL draft to the Tennessee Titans. And this is a change for me because pre-draft in our show last week, you heard me say that Mekhi Lemon was my number 1 wide receiver. But when it comes down to these final rankings, they're still in the same tier. Carnell Tate, Mekhi Lemon, Jordan Tyson, all in the same tier in tier 2. But I do think that the draft capital is going to have to matter here. And it's not everything, because as you're going to notice, I still do have Mekhi Lemon ahead of Jordan Tyson, albeit barely. In fact, I flip-flopped that a few times before recording this show. But Carnell Tate going 4th overall, being a top 5 pick, He goes to a situation where he is the clear number one receiver right out of the gate. And, there's not going to be a ton of target competition there. Calvin Ridley in the later stages of his career. You've got, a couple young guys that were middle round picks from a year ago, but nobody that's really going to get in Carnell Tate's way of being a true number one. And so if Cam Ward is going to be successful, Carnell Tate's going to be a huge reason why. So I think that everything is lined up for Carnell Tate to be a wide receiver one in fantasy football, or worst case to, fall into that high wide receiver two range from a fantasy perspective, which is still going to be very, very helpful for your fantasy team. And again, this does rely a bit on Cam Ward taking the next step, but I would like to give him the benefit of the doubt, despite the fact that I'm not entirely sold. It's going to be something where if he comes out and just stinks in year two, okay, we've given him his 2 full years, next year's draft class loaded. Tennessee is going to have the option to re-roll at QB if they don't like Cam Ward in 2027, because there are so many quarterbacks in that class that are going to be first-round caliber players, at least at this stage, that, again, I think there's going to be a number of teams that could choose to examine their QB position if things don't go well in 2026. So, but for now, I like the situation. I think he's one of the safest players in the draft. I think he can be a very high-end receiver. You love the fact that he went 4th overall. And so Carnell Tate, enough is there for him to jump Mekhi Lemon in my rankings. At number 4, I do have Mekhi Lemon. And again, I had him at number 1 coming out pre-draft, but I have him falling down to wide receiver 2 at this point. He comes out of USC. He went 20th overall in the first round to the Philadelphia Eagles, who traded up ahead of the Steelers to get him, which was a pretty entertaining moment in the draft. If you missed it, the Steelers had called Mekhi Lemon to draft him, and then the Eagles traded up ahead of the Steelers and called him to let him know, hey, just kidding, you're not going to Pittsburgh, you're coming to Philly. So pretty cool moment there. And it's a good fit. In fact, I think it's a much better fit than if he had gone to the Steelers. It would have been nice if he'd been drafted, 5 or 10 picks earlier. But here we are. He goes to the Eagles. It pretty much confirms that A.J. Brown is going to be traded later on this summer, more than likely to the New England Patriots. So Mekhi Lemon will have a chance to operate as the clear number 2 right away in this offense. But I do think there's a very legitimate chance that going into 2027, we think of Mekhi Lemon as the Eagles' number 1 wide receiver. So I do think that's going to be a really nice role to have. I think he fits the Eagles' offense a little bit better than even A.J. Brown would over the next year or two. And I've really liked what Mekhi Lemon brings to the table from a he's a pure route runner. He has great hands, competitive, tough guy. He had incredible production last year at USC. And even though he has a little bit of a size limitation, he's not the biggest player. I do like the situation. I like what we saw from him this past year at USC. And I don't think you have the same injury risk that comes with a Jordan Tyson, who we're going to talk about next. So that definitely plays into it. So let's talk about Jordan Tyson. He's at number 5 in my rankings, coming out of Arizona State. He went 8th overall in the NFL draft to the New Orleans Saints, and he's my last player in tier 2. So I like Jordan Tyson, and I am very, very encouraged by the landing spot, getting top 10 capital. It shows that, hey, some of these NFL teams aren't that worried about the injuries. He had a nice workout in the week or two leading up to the draft, which sounds like it was very beneficial for his draft stock. And he goes to a situation in New Orleans where they've got Chris Olave, they've got Tyler Shuck, they have Travis, no longer goes by ETN, Travis Achan is how he wants his last name to be pronounced. Alvin Kamara still there for now. So it's a pretty solid group over there in New Orleans. And if Tyler Shuck can be the QB of the future, which it seems like he can be, the sky is the limit for Jordan Tyson. So I do think that he has a very high ceiling, just like Lemon and Tate do. And it wouldn't shock me in any way if Jordan Tyson ends up being the best receiver in this class, the best fantasy receiver. I view all 3 of these players so closely together that this is not some me flag planting, Carnell Tate or Mekhi Lemon over Jordan Tyson. It's not like that. They're very, very similar to me. You could shake them up, mix them up, give me any one of them at a position 103 through 105 in your draft, and I would be just fine with it. I really am not going to hold anything against anyone that would have those players ranked in some different order than this, because I don't think there is necessarily a right way to order these players. I think they're all very, very talented. They're really kind of the remaining elite players in this draft class before we drop down into the players we hope will be great, but you're not quite sure as you are compared to these types of players in terms of Tyson, Lemon, and Tate. So that's how I feel about the situation. I think it's a really solid landing spot. Obviously there's going to be some target competition early with Chris Olave, whereas, Carnell Tate doesn't have a whole lot of that. Mekhi Lemon is going to have to compete with Devontae Smith. So, definitely some similarities there in terms of entering situations with already established, high-level wide receivers. So we'll see how that shakes out. But Jordan Tyson is my number 5 player in my rankings. All right, here we go at number 6. This is where things start to get very, very difficult. So I have a 5-player tier from 106 to 110 in my rankings. I have ranked these players and re-ranked these players so many times over the past 24 hours that I still just don't know that I'm confident in how I have these players, because we have players that I liked more than others prior to the draft, but then we have guys that received elite draft capital. We have guys that ended up in bad situations. And then we have Ty Simpson, the quarterback, who ended up going way higher than expected. And hey, in a Superflex league, quarterbacks matter. So we've got to somehow figure out this 5-player tier starting at number 6. So here's what I have right now. It wouldn't shock me if at some point in the coming weeks I make a minor tweak to this tier here. But again, I think this is probably how I'm going to enter my drafts thinking. So 106, I'm going to go with KC Concepcion out of Texas A&M, wide receiver. He went 24th overall to the Cleveland Browns. And, excuse me, Concepcion is somebody that I had behind Omar Cooper Jr. heading into the draft. However, Concepcion did go 6 picks higher in the draft. He went to the Browns, whereas Cooper went to the Jets at the 30th pick. And I do find the situation that Concepcion is in to be better than the situation that Cooper is in. And it's not just because, hey, Concepcion went a few picks higher. There is going to be target competition for both players in different ways. But I do believe that there is a ceiling for KC Concepcion to be the number 1 in Cleveland, whereas I don't think that's going to be an option for Omar Cooper right away. Especially given that they also went out and drafted Kenyon Sadiq. So obviously Garrett Wilson is over there in New York. Jerry Jeudy is in Cleveland. I'm not so worried about Jerry Jeudy. Harold Fannin Jr. is probably the player that is going to be more of a thorn in KC's side. So, but the analytics support KC Concepcion here. He also is an elite separator, and that is something that I really do care a lot about. So there are a number of things I like about several of the players in this tier. Between the draft capital, the opportunity to be the true number 1 wide receiver in the offense, and he's got that ability to separate, the early career production. There's a lot still to like about KC Concepcion, despite the drops that he had in college. That's kind of my one thing with him is, hey, is he going to be able to catch the ball? Is he going to be able to improve his ability to hang on to some more passes? That's really going to be the key to his success. But at the 106 in this draft, I do have KC Concepcion. At number 7, this is the spot that I've changed the most because I think I've had 3 different players from one moment to the next. I went with Jadarian Price, the running back out of Notre Dame, who was drafted with the 32nd overall pick, final pick of the first round, went to the Seattle Seahawks, and this is a player that was not even my running back 2 pre-draft, so this scares me a lot. It's something where I will likely explore trade situations when I'm on the clock in leagues where I might be picking in this 106 to 108 range and either move up into the top 5 or slide towards the back of this tier. It really just depends. It's a situation where you have to just go, get your guys, but you have to take into consideration the fact that Jadarian Price is now a first-round running back, which carries a lot of weight. And in this class, where there were no second-round running backs and only one in the third round, I mean, newsflash, my running backs in this draft, I hardly have any. I think compared to normal years, it is probably about half the number of running backs that I would normally have going. I think I have 12 total running backs in my top 50 in my rankings. And in my top 24 that we're going to go over today, I think I have 4. So 4 total running backs that I have in my top 24. So that, I think, increases the value for somebody like Jadarian Price. He goes to a very good situation in Seattle where his new running back mate is going to be sidelined for a bit due to injury. So that is certainly something that you have to take into account. Zach Charbonnet, very good player, but was always more of a part-time player there with Kenneth Walker. It's a little strange to me that Seattle just didn't re-sign Kenneth Walker rather than spend a first-round pick on Jadarian Price, because we just don't know a ton about what Price can really do in the NFL, especially as a pass catcher. I think he's going to be a solid enough runner, and he'll probably fit in well with the Seattle offense. But there's more questions, I think, than there are answers about his ability to, play at an elite level. However, the track record of these first-round running backs is good. It's a weak running back class, and he is somebody that, given the draft capital and the team fit and the scenario where that Jadarian Price is going to be on the field, getting carries and being a relevant fantasy asset immediately. And unfortunately, I just don't know that you can say that about some of the other players in this range. And so Jadarian Price is a guy that I think in this range at the 107, I'd be willing to take a shot on. I will say I've seen some people pump him up into the top 5, like ahead of whoever their least favorite top 3 receiver is. I would not do that. That would scare me a ton. That's just not a move that I'm going to be looking to make. I even don't know that I'd bump him ahead of Concepcion, but I suppose I could see that. It just makes me nervous, right? Because I wasn't all that high on him pre-draft. It's more of you like the draft capital and the landing spot. You don't necessarily love the player, so I'm willing to take a shot on how the Seahawks view him, but it's going to make me a little bit nervous to click draft. At number 8, I've got Kenyon Sadiq, tight end out of Oregon. He went 16th overall to the New York Jets, and we might as well talk about them together. At number 9, I have Omar Cooper Jr. out of Indiana, wide receiver, and he went 30th overall to the New York Jets, who traded back into the first round. So Sadiq is at 8, and again, we're talking a tight end premium league. That really made a big difference here between him and Omar Cooper, because I do love Omar Cooper Jr. as a prospect, and had Cooper gone about 10 picks higher, or even if it was only 2 picks higher, but it was to a better scenario, I think that Cooper would likely be higher in my ranks. In fact, the landing spot is probably the number one reason that Cooper is not number 6 in my rankings. So I do like Omar Cooper Jr. a lot. He's an elite tackle breaker. He forces tackles at a crazy high rate. He's got good speed, agility. He's somebody that destroys zone coverage, and he's still got pretty good size too. So he's somebody that I think will be a very successful number 2 receiver for the Jets behind Garrett Wilson. But I think that's the big problem from a fantasy perspective, is that there is Garrett Wilson there. So Cooper Jr. and Kenyon Sadiq are going to have to compete with that. But the Jets took Sadiq before Cooper, again, in a tight end premium league where you have the opportunity to potentially get the number 1 tight end in this class. I do think that matters compared to taking a wide receiver 5. So that's why I have Sadiq ahead of Cooper, because I do think that there is likely a plan in place for the Jets to get Sadiq involved right away. I think you can, last year the Jets took another tight end in the second round. I think you can kiss that goodbye. I think this is something where, it's a new Well, I guess it's not that new of a regime because they just took over last year and drafted the guys, in the 2025 class. But Kenyon Sadiq is going to be the starting tight end for the Jets is essentially the point I'm trying to make. He's going to be the dude, and Cooper is going to be the number 2 wide receiver behind Garrett Wilson, and it's going to be a 3-man attack essentially in the passing game between Wilson, Sadiq, and Cooper. But the positional value of a tight end in a Superflex league, along with the draft capital, the elite testing as well is something that is definitely intriguing because we just haven't seen really anything like a Kenyon Sadiq at tight end in the NFL. So while he's a touch undersized, it's kind of that mystery box of if he hits, who knows how good he could really be. Whereas Omar Cooper Jr., I think, I'd be surprised if he turns into a, top 5, top 10 NFL wide receiver. It's something of, can he be, a mid to high level wide receiver 2 in fantasy? Yes, I think so, but I have a hard time believing that he's going to be a wide receiver 1, a top 12 fantasy wide receiver, at least in the first couple years, while there's still Garrett Wilson there. The quarterback situation is not great. The coaching situation is not great. They could be in a whole new situation next year. I do like what the Jets are doing. They have multiple first-round picks next year, and so I could absolutely see a situation where they get a high-end starter, whether it's Dante Moore, an Arch Manning, whoever, next year. And this becomes a pretty attractive spot to be, but it's still a very crowded room. It's a lot to project. And so for those reasons, I have Concepcion and Price ahead of Sadiq and Cooper, but they're all still in tier 3. And, I wouldn't blame anybody for shuffling up this order, but I do have Sadiq at 8 and Cooper at number 9. At number 10, and the final player in tier 3, I've got Ty Simpson, a quarterback out of Alabama. He went 13th overall to the Rams in what was a pretty surprising move of the NFL draft. It was probably the first, the real big surprise of night 1. There's a lot of talk about Simpson going late first. Would somebody trade back in to get him, or would he fall to the top of the second, etc.? And the Rams just decided, hey, this is our guy of the future. We're going to pick him here. We like him. We're going to stick him behind Stafford until he retires. And I think that's my big problem here with Simpson is I get that Stafford has had some injury issues, especially with his back in recent seasons, but I don't necessarily get the sense that Matthew Stafford is anywhere close to being ready to retire. Not to say that he won't after this year. He certainly could. But I tend to see it as he's probably got at least 2 years left, and it wouldn't shock me if he wanted to play 3. And I know that Sean McVay and the Rams are not going to say goodbye to Matthew Stafford in 2027 just because they drafted Ty Simpson. I think we all saw that Sean McVay didn't appear to be very thrilled with the draft pick. I think that's a little bit overthinking things and looking too much into it. I wouldn't necessarily give that a ton of credit there, but it's interesting to me in that this is a team that is built to win a Super Bowl now, and then they pick a player who's not going to help them for at least a full season, if not 2 or 3. It's a situation where think of like at what Atlanta did a couple years ago with Michael Penix, except I don't know that Ty Simpson is even as good as Michael Penix. Maybe similar tier of prospect, but and Michael Penix Jr. went in the middle of the second round as a top 10 pick. So Ty Simpson to me, I think is a very solid pick at number 10 in this draft. But I don't know that I'm willing to take any of these other position players that I view as more high-end talents. Omar Cooper, Kenyon Sadiq, Casey Concepcion, Jadarian Price, I view them all as, a step ahead of Ty Simpson. But I do think because of the positional value, you have to include Ty Simpson in this tier. He's just going to be my final pick of the tier at number 10. Okay, so if you own a first-round pick after pick number 10, I am sorry. If you own a second-round pick or a third-round pick or a fourth-round pick in this draft, I am sorry. If you are a rebuilding team that traded a bunch of starting-level players away for draft picks in 2026, and especially if you ended up with multiple late firsts from contending teams that went on to get in the money, I am sorry, because this draft from this point on is really, really, really rough. It is by far the worst second round than I can remember. It is brutal. The third, like my entire second round is essentially one tier that could be completely interchangeable from my number 14 player to my number 25 player, which is the first pick of the third round. So we're going to get into that in a moment. And then even my third round is essentially one big tier as well. So we're going to, like I said, third round will come later on in another episode. But right now here, the back of the first and then the entire second round is a huge mess. And my overarching message to you as a drafter in this area of the draft is going to simply be take your guy. Don't get too caught up into the draft capital or who I am telling you to take or who somebody else is telling you to take. Go based on the guys that you want, because chances are there's going to be a ton of busts in this range. So see what your team needs. If you need a running back, there's a couple here you can target. I think it's a solid area in the second round, mid to late second, to take some shots on tight ends. There's even a couple quarterbacks that you could take a shot on in the second round. So it's really just pick your poison. Go with your gut on the guys that you think ended up in spots to be successful, because I don't know that there really is anything from here on out that is an obvious pick or, the guy that you have to take. Your second round is going to go very, very different in all of your leagues if you're in multiple leagues. And I don't even know that you can take what you see happen in one league and carry it over to another and have it matter a whole lot, because I do think it's going to be very different. And so let's kick things off. Let's get into my number 11 player, and that is going to be Eli Stowers out of Vanderbilt, tight end. He went 22nd in the second round, so a mid to late second round pick to the Philadelphia Eagles. And it's an interesting spot because he does operate in similar areas of the field as Mekhi Lemon. He's more of a possession guy over the middle, that kind of thing, as opposed to a deep threat. So that's interesting. There's also the fact that they still have Dallas Goedert there in Philadelphia, although it is on a short-term contract, so it should be something where Stowers, gets his feet wet this year and then probably takes over the starting job in 2027. And Stowers is an elite receiving threat at the tight end position. He's really more of a big slot wide receiver. So if you're into that style of player, you will love Eli Stowers. And he is really the best option, I think, at this point in the draft. I think he gives you high upside, especially in a Superflex league. If you are in a non-Superflex league, he'd probably be a spot, maybe even 2 lower than he is right here, but still in this 1-2 turn range. And so Eli Stowers is going to be my number 11 player. I think there's definitely a tier gap between him and Kenyon Sadiq. So I do have Eli Stowers in my 4th overall tier. And then in terms of tight ends, he's my tier 2 tight end. But it's enough of a gap that I definitely have Sadiq a couple spots ahead of Stowers. I know there was some debate among people in the Dynasty community prior to the draft, but Stowers isn't going to do anything as a blocker, and I do fear that it could limit his opportunities to be on the field as a rookie. So it's more of a play for 2027 than it is for 2026, but I definitely like the potential. And with the final pick in the first round at 112, my 12th overall player, I have Denzel Boston, wide receiver out of Washington. He went with the 7th pick in the second round to the Cleveland Browns. So Cleveland doubled up at receiver. They took Casey Concepcion at 124, and then Denzel Boston at the 207. And very different style receivers. Boston's a much bigger guy. He's probably going to play on the outside, but he's still a solid route runner. I think he can be a very capable number 2 wide receiver. But it's a bit of an interesting pick, given that they do still have Jerry Jeudy. Harold Fannin is there, so it's going to be a little bit of a crowded situation for Boston. I would have enjoyed seeing him go to the 49ers or to the Bills or one of these other teams in this range, but I at least can understand it a bit. Cleveland definitely needs help on offense at the wide receiver position, and in a class like this where maybe you're not sold on a ton of guys, you double up and just hope that at least one can be a hit. So we'll see what happens for the Browns, but I think Denzel Boston as an early second-round pick is a pretty solid choice at 112 in your rookie drafts. With the first pick in the second round, so 13th overall, the 201, I have Jeremy Bernard, wide receiver out of Alabama. He went with the 15th pick in the second round to the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the Steelers, who did not come away with Mekhi Lemon, do get their guy in the second in Bernard. And Bernard is my final player in tier 4. So Stowers, Boston, and Bernard make up a 3-man tier at the end of the first pick of the second. And Bernard is going to fit in as the number 3 receiver in Pittsburgh right out of the gate, behind DK Metcalf and Michael Pittman. And then more than likely, at least one of those 2 players will be moving on in 2027. So I could see Bernard moving into a number 2 role in this offense. And that's kind of where I see him as an NFL player. I don't really think he has a number 1 ceiling, but he can be a capable player that, you can flex in your lineups. So he definitely is going to have some flex-worthy games in his career, probably starting in year 2. Again, year 1 is going to be a little bit rough, but the draft capital is nice. He goes to a situation where, there is, a bright future in terms of some playing time, but I wouldn't say he has a terribly high ceiling. But again, from here on out, it's really just take your favorite guy, because I don't think really any of these players have massive ceilings from here on out. But Bernard does feel like a relatively safe pick in this range. All right, so at number 14, we're going to kick off tier number 5. So from 14 all the way to 25 is all one tier. So from here through the end of the show is all tier 5. And like I mentioned, you could rearrange these guys in any order. You could start with my number 25 player at number 14, and I would not be upset at all. I think this is a mix of a few things. I'm, of course, going to be looking at some of the draft capital and their team fit situation. I'm going to be looking at their upside, the ability that they turn into an impactful fantasy player. And then I'm also leaning a bit into my pre-draft evaluations here of the guys that I really think are more talented than others, and then combining that with the other information like their landing spot in the draft capital, etc. So at number 14, I have Antonio Williams, wide receiver out of Clemson. He went with the 7th pick in the 3rd round to the Washington Commanders, and he is a slot-only player, but he is somebody that I could see quickly becoming the wide receiver 2 in this offense, and being somebody that is peppered with targets in a PPR league. So if Jaden Daniels stays healthy, this team definitely needed another weapon at the wide receiver position, and given this spot, the draft capital, I think there's a reasonable chance that he is somebody that is helpful in a PPR scoring format. If you don't play in a PPR league, you are in half point or standard scoring, probably wouldn't be taking him at this position in the draft. But in a PPR league, I think that 14 is a fine spot for Antonio Williams, who did have some solid production throughout his career at Clemson, and goes to a team, again, that really needed some depth at wide receiver 2. All right, at number 15, we have our next running back. So it's been a little while. Jarian Price at number 7. Now here we are at number 15. And Jonah Coleman, running back out of Washington. He went in the 4th round with the 8th pick in the 4th round to the Denver Broncos. And this is a pick where you have to figure he's going to factor into the rotation here. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be J.K. Dobbins. It's going to be R.J. Harvey. It's going to be Jonah Coleman. One of them will probably pull away as the most impactful for fantasy. If I had to guess, it'd probably be J.K. Dobbins for 2026. I just think that R.J. Harvey, he was okay last year when he got his opportunity, but I think we're seeing that it was a reach last year, and it's going to be some version of a committee, right? And so I'm not going to tell you that Jonah Coleman is going to be some elite running back for fantasy, but he'll be on the field at certain points this year. He definitely has some level of fantasy ceiling, especially into 2027 if J.K. Dobbins moves on or the team decides that, hey, they're not seeing enough from R.J. Harvey. But more than likely, this is a committee running back fitting into a team that's going to like to run the ball. He can catch the ball as well. He's a good 3-down all-around back. But this is more of a safe play of a guy who's going to be on the field as opposed to a sky-high ceiling play. But that's kind of what we're dealing with at running back, which is pretty unfortunate. There's really only one other player that I see as having a really high ceiling at running back, and we'll talk about him in a couple picks. But Jonah Coleman, with that early 4th-round capital, checks in at number 15. All right, at number 16, this is going to be Elijah Surratt out of Indiana. He went with the 15th pick in the 4th round to the Baltimore Ravens, and strangely enough, he was not even the first wide receiver that Baltimore took. They took Jacoby Lane out of USC in the middle of the 3rd round. So it's a little bit weird that I would have Elijah Surratt ahead of Jacoby Lane, but I think they play very different styles of wide receiver, and I think that Surratt is going to be more impactful for fantasy in my eyes. To me, Jacoby Lane, who spoiler alert, I have him down near the beginning of my 3rd round in my rankings right now. I currently have him at number 30. And Lane is a big outside X receiver that's going to be more of that sacrificial X player where he just runs a lot of routes and does, is a deep threat, red zone type of guy, but he's not going to be much of a possession receiver. Whereas Surratt, we've actually heard DaCosta, the GM for the Ravens, come out already this weekend and talk about how much he likes Elijah Surratt as an inside, big slot, power slot type of wide receiver, which is music to our ears because that really fits his game better than being an outside wide receiver. So to me, this is going to shape up to be something where you're going to have Flowers and Surratt more in the slot inside role in the offense, with Bateman and Lane on the outside as the X receivers. And so it could take some time, but I do think that there is definitely PPR upside for Elijah Surratt to be an impact player. But I will admit, taking a guy that went in the 4th round of the draft in the early to mid portion of the 2nd round is not going to feel very good. So I would imagine that I'm going to be much higher than consensus on Elijah Surratt. But it's, I think that just tells you kind of how this class is, because in a normal year, I would never have a 4th round player, let alone back-to-back 4th round players with Jonah Coleman and Elijah Surratt. But here we are. It's a guy that I like. I know there's going to be some issues with separation, but he's got great production. He's great against zone. He's somebody that I think can really operate well as a big slot player in this offense. So I'm willing to take the shot, in the mid-2nd of the draft. Next up at number 17 is Chris Bell, wide receiver out of Louisville, and he went with the 30th pick in the 3rd round. So Chris Bell, a couple of things about him. Number one, he went to a very good landing spot with Miami. Although strangely, he also was not the first wide receiver that Miami took. So just like Surratt, Bell went to a team that took another player ahead of him, which was sort of a weird pick, taking Caleb Douglas with the 11th pick in the 3rd round out of Texas Tech. Spoiler alert, he is late 3rd round in my rankings as Caleb Douglas. So I think that Chris Bell is the better player. I think he was better in college. I think he'll be better in the pros. The downside for Chris Bell is going to be the injury that he has. He had the ACL tear. He's going to miss some time more than likely this year and be added into the offense later on as the season goes. So this is really more of a pick building for 2027. And given Miami's wide receiver room where there just isn't a lot of talent, I think that Chris Bell has a chance to be the most talented player by the time this season ends, and will have a role in this offense moving into next year. Although you would, again, assume that they will likely draft someone at some point next year as well. But for now, I think there is some future value with Chris Bell, and I would imagine that his value is likely to hold relatively steady going into next season, because a lot of people are just going to be understanding of the fact that, hey, there was an injury, he's going to miss time. I think it's baked into his draft capital. So if you can nab him in the middle of the 2nd round, I think it's a solid value pick to hold on and wait for 2027. If you were a rebuilding team, I think he definitely fits your build more than a contending team. But given the options in this class, you might not get a chance to be that picky. So Chris Bell comes in at number 17. At number 18, I have what is probably going to be my favorite sleeper in the class, and I am sure that I am not going to be alone in this opinion. But Nick Singleton, running back out of Penn State, comes in as my RB4 post-draft. He went late in the 5th round, 25th in the 5th round, to the Tennessee Titans. So Tennessee has Tony Pollard. They have Tajay Spears, but I believe both are on the final year of their contract. And so Nick Singleton, if he can get some playing time, and both Spears and Pollard have struggled with injuries from time to time, he could get some opportunities. And all you got to do is get on the field and make a few plays, and all of a sudden things can change very quickly for how a team might view you. Now, the big issue is going to be his own injury with the foot that he injured several months ago in the pre-draft process. So that will play into things. But if he can be ready to go by the time the season begins, I think that will be very beneficial for him and his future in terms of having some sort of role within this offense. But again, 5th round pick going in the middle of the 2nd round, kind of a tough situation, but running backs are so important. I think this is a fair enough spot to take that shot in a rookie draft. At number 19, we have Dazon Stribling, wide receiver out of Ole Miss. He went with the first pick of the 2nd round to the San Francisco 49ers, who continued their tradition of reaching on players way more than anyone expected. So Stribling definitely was getting hyped up a bit coming into the draft. I think there was a lot of talk that, hey, this could be a guy that goes later on day 2, sometime in the 3rd round. But I don't think anybody was expecting him to be the 33rd overall pick. So that was a surprise. And he goes to a situation where, at worst, he should be able to step on the field as the number 3. And there's Mike Evans now in San Francisco. They have Ricky Pearsall. George Kittle's going to soak up some targets, although he has some injury issues of his own. So we'll see. I'm a little bit skeptical, but this is where, hey, at this point in the draft, in this type of class, you can take the bet on the draft capital and just hope that the NFL team knew what they were doing. So the 49ers, they have a great coaching staff. Maybe they can find a way to make this work. He had some productive years in college. So, Stribling, I kind of viewed him pre-draft as like a poor man's Trey Harris. And I didn't mind Trey Harris last year. So, this was probably going to be a guy that originally I was going to be looking at more in the 3rd round. But with the draft capital, I think you can bump him up into the 2nd. I don't think you can really afford to bump him all the way down to the 3rd, even if you didn't like him pre-draft, just given that there weren't a lot of other awesome landing spots among some of these wide receivers. So Dazon Stribling checks in at number 19. At number 20, I have a small school wide receiver in Ted Hurst. So he went to Georgia State, drafted with the 20th pick in the 3rd round by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And it's an interesting landing spot. It's pretty solid. He's got a chance to be the true outside guy more than likely in 2027. There's already some target competition. Obviously, Agbuka is there, Chris Godwin. It's something where Tampa has consistently drafted receivers over the past couple seasons and found some good use for them. They've been a pretty nice offense for fantasy. Now, I would expect Ted Hurst to enter the year as the number 4 wide receiver on this team, but he'll have the chance to fit in as an outside guy. He should firmly at least be in that top 4 rotation, but it's one of those things where how can the small school player adjust to the NFL level? He's got the body size at 6'4" to be a true outside X receiver. So, sky's the limit. Maybe they kind of view him as their Mike Evans light type of player. And I'm more than happy to take a shot on that type of player here in the middle of the 2nd round. Next up, we have a little bit of a run on tight ends. So at 21, I have Max Clare, tight end out of Ohio State, transferred over from Purdue. He went at the back of the 2nd round at the 29th pick in the 2nd to the LA Rams. which is kind of infuriating because they just took Terrence Ferguson last year, who I liked. I think a lot of people like. He flashed and had some good moments when he got on the field as a rookie. And it feels strange, again, that this team took a position and a player that might not help them a ton in year one. So I don't know if this is something where we should be reading into the fact that, hey, maybe the Rams don't like Terrence Ferguson that much or what. But they're both pretty similar prospects. They're both solid players. I would have been happy to take Max Clare if he had gone in this range to pretty much anyone else. And so it's a little bit tough given that the competition is going to be there. They have like 5 tight ends on the roster that are all going to be somewhat relevant, or at least have been at one point or another. Obviously, you're not going to have 5 at one time, but there is Colby Parkinson, there is Tyler Higbee still there, and then you got everybody from last year. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think at the back of the second round, taking a tight end that went in the second round that had a good receiving production profile in college, I think is always a fair shot to take. And so Max Clare comes in at number 21. At number 22, I have Oscar Delp, tight end out of Georgia. He went with the 9th pick in the 3rd round to the New Orleans Saints. And this is a player that I think ends up, again, another good, a better situation than where Max Clare ended up, with pretty good, respectable draft position. So early 3rd round pick, Juwan Johnson is there, but the depth chart is going to be much easier to climb with the Saints for Oscar Delp. So Delp, highly athletic tight end, had some pretty solid production throughout his entire career at Georgia. The big thing for him is that he never really had a breakout year. He hovered around 200 yards receiving each of his last 3 seasons, never had a huge spike in that production. So you wonder if that's more the offense or the team, or is it more the player, the quarterback, etc. It's hard to say. But in a class that is this weak, I think taking Oscar Delp in the back of the second is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. In fact, I think he's one of the few players that really provides a relatively high ceiling. So even though the production is not awesome, he's definitely going to have some opportunities, and that is something that you should be shooting for in the back of the second. Similar in terms of climbing up the depth chart is going to be our number 23 player, Eli Raridan, tight end out of Notre Dame. He went to the New England Patriots with the 31st pick in the 3rd round. So another 3rd round tight end. And New England, just like New Orleans, has a tight end depth chart that could be somewhat easy to climb if he can put it all together. So Hunter Henry is there, but he is pretty late into his career. He's in his 30s. So probably not as a rookie, but as a sophomore player in the NFL in 2027, Eli Raridan will definitely have some fantasy value and has some upside. So, he's a big dude. He can block, but he can also catch the ball a bit. Although his production, while his final year was better than somebody like Oscar Delp, it did take some time for him to really show out on the field in terms of that receiving work. So, bit of a trade-off. Do you want the guy that got on the field and had solid production early, but never exploded? Or do you want the guy that took a little while to get things going in the field, but then did have a good breakout once he did? So hard to say. I'm going to side with Delp in the draft capital. A little bit easier of a depth chart to climb, but Raridan's still definitely a player that I like. All right. 2 more players left that we're going to talk about today. We'll give you my number 24 player and then our first pick of the 3rd round just for fun. So we give you my top 25. And number 24 is going to be Carson Beck, quarterback out of Miami. He went with the first pick in the 3rd round to the Arizona Cardinals. So Carson Beck played a very long time in college, had a lot of success in college between Georgia and Miami, and was always, an above average college quarterback. I would never really say that he was elite, but was good. It was a very good college quarterback. He's older. He's got a ton of starting experience. Made the playoff multiple times, national championship game this past year, of course, with Miami, and had a lot of success at Georgia as well in the playoffs. So experienced. He's a winner. a lot to like from that standpoint. It sounds like he definitely did some growing up throughout his career. There was some maturity issues, I think, at one point at Georgia, but sounds like he figured some things out at Miami. And Arizona clearly decided that he was the guy that they wanted to take their shot on in the mid-rounds. So anytime a team with the quarterback depth chart like Arizona takes a quarterback in the early third round, it's going to be something that we have to pay attention to from a dynasty standpoint, because there's a pretty good likelihood that Carson Beck is going to start at least a few games this year. And if he plays well, that changes a lot. So if in the mid to late second round, you can take a shot on that type of player where, hey, the odds are he's not going to amount to being a starting level quarterback in the league. But if he is, and he's going to get that opportunity, you have to think he's going to get that ability to start or that chance to start games at some point in the year, because Arizona is not going to be very good. They're going to want to see what they have, and then they're going to have to make their decision about who, do they move on from him and just draft somebody in 27? More than likely, yes. But if he plays really well, you win a few games, you never know. So Carson Beck being the first pick of the third round, I think is definitely a reason to take him in the back half of the second round of rookie drafts. And at number 25, the last player that we'll really dive into on today's show, Drew Aller, Penn State quarterback, and he went with the 12th pick in the third round to the Pittsburgh Steelers. So similar in nature to Carson Beck with Arizona. The Steelers have a very poor quarterback depth chart. Currently, Will Howard is the starter, although the expectation, of course, is that it will be Aaron Rodgers. But if Aaron Rodgers decides, hey, I'm actually not coming back, which, would be mildly surprising, but Aaron Rodgers is, crazy enough that I think he could do whatever, and, it's just going to be something that maybe people aren't going to be that surprised by, because he's a little bit erratic. So Drew Aller has the size, has some of the skill sets. Now, he didn't play very well this past year. Had, obviously, an injury that knocked him out for the latter half of the season. So, there's definitely some stuff to work back from here. But this was a guy that was talked about as a first-round, top 5 pick a year ago. I mean, he was somebody that everyone had penciled into the first round, and things did not go well for him. They did not go well for Penn State. So, does he stink? Maybe. But again, if he's going to get the chance to start a few games, we'll see if the Steelers, how they do during the season. But I could see a situation where they're out of the playoffs in the final week or two of the season, he can start a game or two. And again, you just never know. And then the best case scenario for Aller from a fantasy perspective would be Aaron Rodgers decides not to come back. And then it turns into a battle between Drew Aller and Will Howard. And I think that'd be a pretty even quarterback battle. You probably give the slight edge to Howard based on the fact that he's been with the team, but you never know. Third round rookie, it's worth a shot in this type of draft. Normally, in a more loaded draft class, I probably would not be advocating for taking a third round quarterback in the second round or at the 2-3 turn of your rookie draft. But this year feels a little different given that there are just not a lot of great landing spots, not a lot of great prospects. And so that's definitely going to play into some of the decision-making at positions like quarterback. So there you have it. There is my top 25 Dynasty, Superflex, Tight End Premium, PPR scoring format rankings. We got through tiers 1 through 5. And in fact, my tier 6 that we'll talk about in a couple weeks, practically my entire third round. So pick number 26 down to 36, all the same. And just for fun, for all my Indiana people, I do have Kalen Black out of Indiana as my number 26 player who went in the third round to the 49ers. So he's my running back 5 in this class, which is pretty wild because I had him as, hey, this is a late round sleeper that might be fun to take in the 4th round of your rookie draft if he gets picked in the 5th or 6th round. And here we are, 49ers, with a bit of a reach, taking Kalen Black. So, it is what it is, right? The 49ers, they've kind of made a habit of this. And we'll talk about all that and more on future shows. But we've been talking a long time. We're an hour into the show, and We've covered our top 25, now 26 players. So we want to thank everyone very much for tuning in. I very much appreciate you. This is a fun, exciting show of the year, and it's a bit of a bummer that the class isn't more exciting. General piece of advice, if you are listening this far, try to trade for some future picks during your upcoming rookie drafts. I'd say especially anything outside of the top 10 in this draft class. If you can trade it for essentially the equal pick of next year, probably worth doing. That's a move that I would probably make. So there you have it. There's your top 25 rankings. This is the Dynasty War Room podcast. Thank you all again very much for tuning in. We'll have all kinds of more information on our social media at the Dynasty War Room page on Twitter. And so stay tuned for some future shows as we get fully rolling into the off season. My name is Andrew Valancourt, and I want to thank you all again very much for listening, and we'll talk to you all next time.